It'd be valuable for the people to know that the prosecuting attorneys are very ethical. Wouldn't that
100%.
make you trust them more and want to support them more? Wouldn't that be good for everybody if they just said a mistake was made when a mistake was made?
It maintains the integrity of it. I mean, Joe, let me say something that might blow your mind. It blew mine. When I had exonerated Nancy Smith and Joseph Allen, it really was the highlight of my career.
Can you tell me what the case was?
Yeah, it was a 94 case, which is interesting because it was happening simultaneously with the same assistant prosecutor as the one that Josh is referring to. They were accused. She was a bus driver. She's now become family to me. So, and they're big fans, Joe, by the way.
Shout out.
Yeah, shout out. So, you know, they were 94. She was a bus driver for a place called Head Start for young kids. She was alleged to have driven these kids after picking them up from their homes back to another individual's house, a male, and severely abused them sexually. Now, the Broadway, which is the road where he allegedly lived off of, is a main thoroughfare through Lorraine. The allegations were so wild that, if you can imagine seeing a school bus pull up on the main street, watch little kids go into a house, they were alleged to have been punished by being tied up outside in trees, which is just impossible. So this is the alleged abuse that occurred because what happened was
Did someone coach the kids?
Yes, that's exactly what occurred.
You know, I've often defended Joe Rogan on this channel, especially when he's facing a lot of attacks from the mainstream media related to a whole host of issues that are related to freedom of speech. Because even if you disagree with somebody like Joe Rogan, you can respect that he's willing to have the conversation on a bunch of these different issues, and what he is doing on his show should not be censored at the behest of the whims of Democratic Party operatives. That being said, sometimes this guy just has terrible judgment, and a perfect example of that is the fact that he brings on a character like Josh Dubin, who is an ambassador for the Innocence Project, by the way, a fraudulent organization that oftentimes works to get guilty people out of jail, and he just lets them spew nonsense on his platform completely unchallenged. No Googling at all whatsoever. He just hears about all these different cases that had no evidence at all whatsoever that proved guilt, yet somehow there was a conviction. Now, of course, this all came to a head last year when Josh Dubin actually lobbied District Attorney Alvin Bragg in order to get Sheldon Johnson out of prison, somebody that Josh Dubin actually acknowledges as guilty. However, he was downplaying the crimes that Johnson committed while on the Rogan podcast and making every excuse in the book for why this guy should have been let out early.
I know I've said this before, and it probably sounds repetitive, but another miracle sitting to my right, just like a marvelous human being who was basically told by a judge, by an African-American judge, that you don't matter, you don't count, and I'm going to throw your life away for a crime in which the victim received 2 stitches, and on a second offense, his first offense being a gun possession charge. So I will say this, that he received a sentence that far eclipses a sentence that would be commonly doled out for murder or manslaughter. So with that, here's Sheldon.
Sheldon, how long you been out for?
Going on 9 months. I got out May 4th.
And you were in for 25?
25 years and 5 months.
For 2 stitches.
2 stitches.
Now, I just wanted you guys to understand that this was not an incident where he got 50 years for 2 stitches. This was an incident where this man ended up nearly killing 2 individuals. He was charged with attempted murder. And of course, this man was a high-level blood gang member. And he pretended like he just stumbled into that throughout the course of this podcast. And Rogan and Dubin just ate this up.
I was blood. I was a gang member. This is where the cut comes from on my face. I have a bunch of stab marks from just being in those environments and being on Rikers Island and just warring with other rival gangs, mostly Latin Kings and Inietas. And I would just stand there, and eventually I just slowly moved up the ranks, and I became this person that I feel like I was never meant to be. But because of the conditions and because of where I was at and because of what I saw, what I was exposed to, made me into someone else.
Now, as we covered in previous videos, a month after this Joe Rogan experience, Sheldon Johnson brutally executed and chopped up another individual, probably related to a gang beef, and Sheldon Johnson obviously had to hang his head in shame, and he should have never been invited back on the podcast for his failure in judgment, because remember, Josh Dubin lobbied to get Sheldon Johnson out of prison early. He would have never been able to commit this murder had he been locked up, but Joe Rogan accepted him back with no issue at all whatsoever. They even laughed about this particular case.
So I guess we just get right into it. The last case that we talked about, we had a very unfortunate incident happen after the podcast, about a month later.
Yeah.
The gentleman beheaded somebody.
Allegedly, yes.
Allegedly.
Even though, again, Josh Dubin aided and abetted this murder by getting this guy out of prison early on the recommendation of District Attorney Alvin Bragg. He swore that this unrepentant, high-level blood gang member was somehow rehabilitated, even though clearly and obviously he wasn't. He wasn't taking any accountability for his past actions, and that resulted in the death and dismemberment of another man. That is on Josh Dubin's head. It should be stapled to him for the rest of his life, and yet he still comes on Rogan, he still brings on additional guests, and wouldn't you know it, we have a similar pattern emerging where he's making the case that all these people who are 100% guilty are actually innocent Beba Angel Aladdins. And the perfect example of this is the fact that he brought this Ohio prosecutor, former prosecutor, called JD Tomlinson, who is a disgraced prosecutor, and he brings him on the show to talk about the cases where he's exonerated people, and one of the ones that he brings up is the case of a woman called Nancy Smith and a man called Joseph Allen, who supposedly were wrongfully convicted of a crime where, guess what, there was no evidence at all whatsoever. I mean, they were accused of child molestation for multiple preschool age children, so this is something that you would want to get right if you're going to talk about it, but they instead bring this woke prosecutor who actually apologized to these criminals, again on video. Let me play that for you right here.
I would like to take this opportunity to thank the court for its guidance as I have attempted to navigate my way through these matters. I'd also like to thank and recognize defense counsel, Mark Gotze and Sharon Katz on behalf of Ms. Smith, and Ricky Parsons and Paula Brown on behalf of Mr. Allen for their tireless work over many years advocating for their innocent clients. And to Ms. Smith and to Mr. Allen, I want to say that I apologize to you, especially for what was done to you and to your families as a result of this ill-conceived prosecution.
And he actually says on the Rogan podcast that there was no evidence at all whatsoever when he was looking into this case that either of these two people are guilty.
And so when I started to look at it, the funny part is during the first 3 or 4 months of me evaluating it, I had a couple investigators that were with me, and we were reading only exculpatory information. Nancy didn't do it. We don't think a crime occurred. And I was wondering, when am I going to start finding the inculpatory information? When am I going to start seeing the guilt? And it just really never happened. And so when I exonerated these two individuals that were clearly innocent, she had done 15 years, Joe. He had done 25. I was in court, and my chief of staff and I had written something to kind of indicate to the court, and I apologized to them for what had occurred to them. After the hearing, Mark Gotze of the Ohio Innocence Project came up to me and said, JD, I got to tell you something. You're the only prosecutor I've ever heard actually apologize to a defendant. Joe, imagine how remarkable that statement is.
That's crazy.
We took 40 years of your life combined, but we're not even going to apologize to you.
Now, I want you to consider what is being told to you. I want you to consider what is being sold to Joe Rogan and his audience without any challenge at all whatsoever, and who is selling it to you. This is a disgraced district attorney, a woke, not prosecute anyone for anything kind of individual that is being brought on by Josh Dubin, who is known for downplaying and misrepresenting facts related to criminals criminals. Getting guilty people out of prison is his life mission, and he is telling you that this guy is legitimate, and then this guy is telling you that he re-examined this case of the child molestation of about 14 victims, and there was no evidence at all whatsoever a crime occurred. Do you believe that? Do you think that's real? Do you think that I have the evidence related to this case to prove that it's false? The answer to your question is you shouldn't believe that. You shouldn't believe this is real, and I definitely have that information. And we're going to break this down, but before we do, with videos like this, it's hard to get monetization, so I'm going to have to throw it to our sponsor, Incogni, because they're really helping make this whole thing possible. Hold on one second. I'm getting a phone call. I have to take it right now in the middle of this video. Hello? I owe tens of thousands of dollars to the U.S. federal government? You're gonna put me in jail unless I pay you right now? Oh my God! Wait, you're giving me the opportunity to pay a smaller amount as long as I do so in a gift card that I give you the information for? Let me get right on that. Yeah, that's me right there, or at least it was me prior to today's sponsor, Incogni. You see, one of the reasons why you're getting so many scam phone calls or spam emails is due to the fact that your personal data becomes vulnerable when you engage in regular, ordinary internet activities, whether that be signing up for a rewards program, making a purchase, or signing up for a free online newsletter. You see, this is the opportunity point for thousands of companies to aggregate, buy, and sell your personal information, and this includes things like your full name and address, a list of your aliases, your email address, your personal phone number, and it can extend all the way to your IP address, your social security number, and other sensitive personal financial information. Now that's the bad news, but the good news is, if you request for your data to be removed, they are obligated to comply with that request. However, since there are thousands of these companies and you don't know how many people or organizations have your personal data, it's going to be basically impossible for you to do it on your own, which is why Incogni exists. Go over to incogni.com/AJW. By the way, use code AJW for 60% off any of their annual plans. And when you sign up, you authorize them to make these takedown requests on your behalf. And what I discovered just in the month of April on my own personal page is that over 200 companies had my own personal data, and the amount of time that it would have taken me to make these requests individually was well over 100 hours. Now, of course, you guys know I'm a YouTuber. I attach my name and face to ideas that cause people out there in the world to want to harm me. So you might think that's why I signed up for Incogni, but that's actually not why I was on board with this company prior to them being a sponsor. You see, people in my own personal life have had to deal with stalking situations. We're talking close relatives. And the thing is, they'll encounter these people at work. All they'll have is their name, but because your personal phone number and your address is available, they were actually able to improve their stalking ability based on this information just being out there online. So it was a no-brainer for me to sign up for Incogni's family plan, because not only does it take care of the security concerns I'm feeling, it actually covers those I hold most dear who are in danger not because of anything having to do with me and my platform, but just due to the ordinary situations that you can find yourself in. So yeah, go to incogni.com/AJW, promo code AJW for 60% off any annual plan. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee, by the way, and make sure you're not vulnerable. Make sure you have control over your data. Protect yourself, and if you want a family plan, protect those you hold most dear. That is incogni.com/AJW. Use code AJW for 60% off any annual plan. Again, incogni.com/AJW, promo code AJW.
So one of the mother that eventually got paid, I think it was about 1.5 million in 95 money, which is a decent amount of money. She had indicated that her daughter had been abused by Nancy, the bus driver. Now, when the investigation occurred, there was a detective on it that did a very thorough investigation, and after months found out that, listen, I don't even think a crime occurred, you know.
So this podcast came out over a month ago. It is dated March 11th of this year. So I've had a month to dig into this particular case, and it's actually been quite difficult to get the real information on this because they've essentially flooded the zone with innocence fraud propaganda. So when you Google this, what you ultimately end up discovering is defense talking points. And what I discovered, by the way, by listening listening to this particular former district attorney is that he's just repeating those same defense talking points as if there wasn't a case against these two individuals. However, what I also discovered is that there are two different narratives in this innocence fraud propaganda campaign. One of them solely revolves around Nancy Smith, and then the other one revolves around Joseph Allen, but sometimes they want to keep them separate because Joseph Allen is essentially a completely indefensible individual and clearly and obviously committed this crime, so there's an effort to separate the two, even though there is no possible way that Joseph Allen could have molested these kids without the assistance of someone, and the most likely person happens to be Nancy Smith, the bus driver of these particular kids. Also, I want to give a shout out and a thank you to Devin Tracy, who, by the way, you can subscribe to on Subscribestar. He's doing an entire series based on this particular case and this podcast, and he actually has gotten the court documents and shared them with me. I think we're the only two people who actually have the original trial transcripts for this case in order for us to figure out who's actually behind this. So definitely subscribe to him. He'll be linked in the description. He 100% deserves it because he put in a lot of work on this case. So we got to go over the allegations, or as the super mayor would call them, allegations.
False allegations and not facts.
So you can hear the other side, the side that doesn't show up on the Rogan podcast. So in the early 1990s, in this Ohio town, there were a bunch of preschool age children who were taking the bus in the morning in order to go to a Head Start program. And the driver of this bus and one of the perpetrators of this crime, who was convicted of this, by the way, is a woman called Nancy Smith, a single mother herself who drove a bunch of different routes in order to make a living after splitting with her husband. Now, she really wants you to understand that she is a mother and she thinks that somehow makes her incapable of committing these crimes, but we all understand that parents can do horrible things, especially to other people's children, even if Nancy thinks that you can't grasp that concept. Now, according to the allegations in this particular case, Nancy Smith would drop off the majority of the children at this Head Start program, and on different occasions, she would take them via the bus or via her own personal vehicle, which we will get into in just a little bit, to the home or other locations where Joseph Allen was, and this is where the abuse against these children happened. Now, it's very important for you to understand the vicious, nasty, disgusting smear campaign that is utilized against the parents and the children in this particular case, because what you heard from JD Tomlinson, the district attorney who took over way later, who was elected after the Black Lives Matter riots, is that essentially this was a money play from the parents. The parents ended up suing Head Start after this occurred, so therefore their whole reason and motivation for falsely accusing these two individuals of child molestation was because they wanted money.
So one of the mother that eventually got paid, I think it was about $1.5 million in 95 money, which is a decent amount of money. She had indicated that her daughter had been abused.
And by the way, this is more directly stated in another program that tried to defend Nancy Smith years ago that is also absolute trash.
The mother that started all this went to other parents and said, "Oh my God, my daughter was molested. You need to go get your child checked." What really made it escalate was that they found no signs of abuse on these children. So she went to the media and she was so irate that she went to the mayor and demanded that they arrest me for that.
Now, I just want you to understand that what they're describing as sinister behavior right there is some of the parents discovering what happened to their kids and then going to the other parents in the community and recommending that their kids get checked out because they don't want other victims to go unreported. And again, what this ultimately ended up leading to is about 14 preschool age children stepping up and saying that they were a victim, although I believe Joseph Allen was only convicted of crimes against a smaller number of them because there was more substantial evidence with those kids. They were also more willing to testify, and their parents were more willing to testify than the other children involved in this particular instance. Now, all of these children knew who Nancy Smith was. All of these children would get on the bus with her each and every day, and it's very important for you to understand that this is the only way they could have been transported by somebody who was in a position of trust to Joseph Allen. This is the only person who could have gotten them there. However, Nancy Smith denies even knowing him.
Police were sure they had their man. The next day, his arrest was front page news. Nancy Smith says that's the first time she'd ever laid eyes on Joseph Allen.
I guess at that point they claimed that he was my boyfriend. I never even met Joseph Allen. I've never seen Joseph Allen. I had no idea who he was. I just seen his picture in the newspaper.
This a total stranger.
I mean, total stranger.
Which is interesting because oftentimes on these buses, there was somebody called a bus aide, a secondary person that was in a ride along with them. And in the court testimony, we actually discovered that this bus aide saw Joseph Allen trying to get aboard the bus. She actually grabbed a tire iron or a crowbar in order to scare him off the bus, only to see him then walking with Nancy arm in arm, and Nancy telling him, again, according to this bus aide, who has no financial incentive to lie, that she would see him later.
He was very confused by the evidence. It wasn't clear. It was plain as day that he couldn't even prove that these two individuals knew one another.
So this is from the trial transcript, and I want to point out that there is a longer exchange that precedes this that talks about how Nancy would sometimes disappear with the bus, saying that she was going to pick up a parent with children on the bus, be gone for 45 minutes to maybe even a little longer, and then return to the school without a parent. So again, they did not always have an aide on the bus that was observing Nancy. She was alone with the kids. Also, she was described as harsh with the kids. But the most important question and answer is right here on page 381, which is, while you were riding with her, did you see anyone else on the bus or attempt to get on the bus that did not belong? And she responds with, there was a man that attempted to get on the bus. Would you describe that day to the court and the jury as best as you can? So it says she stopped at this store and I don't know the name of it. All I know is that it's like a bright mint green store in Lorraine, right around the corner from Nativity. And then the question is, do you know which street it's on? And the answer is not right offhand. I just remember the color of the store because it was so bright. Now, by the way, from actually reading over Nancy Smith's testimony, who did in fact testify in her own defense, I believe this store is called Flinger's Market Plus Catering. It's still open to this very day because this is a location that Nancy testified she would get off from time to time on occasion in order to go into to buy a soda in order to come back out and then continue on her bus route. And by the way, she even said that she would sometimes leave the kids unattended when she did so. Now back to the transcript. She went in, she said she was going to get a pop. Question, do you know when this was? Answer, this was before she left for the funeral. So when would that be approximately? Answer, the middle of April of 93. Answer, of 93. Question, and what happened? Answer, a black man tried to get on the bus. He walked with a shuffle, mumbled, I couldn't understand a thing he was saying. He came up to the steps and I picked up a tire iron that was on the bus and told him if he came up another step, I was going to knock him off the steps. I asked him, would he please leave? A question, did you ask him? Answer, I told him. Question, were you screaming at him? Answer, I told him to get off the bus. It scared me to death when he tried to come up on the bus because she left the door open when she went in the store. Question, does she often shop at this store? Answer, yes, she did. Question, would she stop there nearly daily? Answer, almost every day. Question, what happened then? He would not get off the bus. He kept mumbling and I could hardly make out anything he said. The only word I kept making out was that he kept saying Nancy, and I told him, Nancy is in the store, get off the bus. He wouldn't get off the bus, and I told him if he did not get off the bus, I was going to hit him with the tire iron, and all the kids started screaming, hit him, hit him. They ran towards the back of the bus. They were egging at me to hit this man. Question, what happened then? I pushed him off the bus, shut the door and locked it, and he walked into the store and came out with Nancy arm in arm. Question, what were you doing while this guy was in the store? Answer, I was on the radio trying to get somebody to come down there. Question, did anyone answer? Answer, no, they would not answer me. Question, so you saw Nancy, defended Smith, come out of the store with somebody? Answer, yes sir, I did. Question, and that was the black male that tried to get on the bus? Answer, yes sir. Question, and how were they walking? Answer, they were walking arm in arm like this, around each other arm in arm. Question, then what happened? They came up to the bus and told me to let him in the bus and that he was a parent. I told her I was not going to open the door and let anybody in the bus. I did not know this man. I had never seen the man, and usually you know who parents are. You get to meet the parents, you see the parents, and I never saw this man before. And she said it was somebody that she had went to school with, and for me to let him on the bus with her because he was going to look for his child. I told her no, I was not letting him on the bus, and if he attempted to get on the bus, I would whack him with the tire iron. Question, so what happened then? Just tell me what happened next. Answer, she told him to go down the street and wait, and she got on the bus. Question, you heard that? Answer, yes, I did. Question, you heard her tell him to go down the street and wait? Answer, yes, I did. Question, and this store was around the corner from the nativity school where the Head Start classes was? Answer, yes, sir, yes. Now, unsurprisingly, this woman ultimately ended up identifying the co-defendant, Joseph Allen, as this person. Now, why did I read that exchange to you guys? Because here you have Josh Dubin of the Innocence Project, a proponent of this innocence fraud movement, bringing on a district attorney, talking about how he's such a great guy for apologizing to Nancy Smith and Joseph Allen. And one of the reasons why he apologized is because when he looked at the evidence, when he looked at this case file that I have obtained, that Devin Tracy has obtained. We're probably the only two people outside of the prosecutor's office that have this information at the ready. He said all he could find was exculpatory evidence.
And so when I started to look at it, the funny part is during the first 3 or 4 months of me evaluating it, I had a couple investigators that were with me. And we were reading only exculpatory information. Nancy didn't do it. We don't think a crime occurred. And I was wondering, when am I going to start finding the inculpatory information? When am I going to start seeing the guilt? And it just really never happened.
All he could find was evidence that proved that these two people were guilty, and they never even established that these two individuals knew each other.
He was very confused by the evidence. It wasn't clear. It was plain as day that he couldn't even prove that these two individuals knew one another.
But here you have an independent witness, not from a random witness statement that nobody was able to find, but in the courtroom testified under oath that these two individuals knew each other, that Nancy had this person pose as a parent. She wasn't buying it. He was trying to get on the bus. And then later on, this individual was told to wait near the school because Nancy would pick him up later. Now, if there's a different account to dispute this, if Joseph Allen actually did have a kid on the bus or anything like that, then the district attorney or the former district attorney, the disgraced former district attorney, JD Tomlinson, should present that. He should present that countervailing evidence to disprove this witness account. He should show us that rather than lie to everybody and say that there's no link at all whatsoever. Nobody could verify a connection between the two. In addition to that, we also have this disgraced district attorney talk about how the original detective on this case didn't actually think that there was much to these allegations. And I will just point out another thing that just isn't disclosed is that original detective, Cantu. The reason that he was tossed off the case is due to the fact that he had a personal connection with members of Nancy's family, and it was actually rumored that he was dating Nancy at the time that the allegations came out. So needless to say, the detective with a personal stake in this, not really following up on the investigation, getting removed, is not unusual at all whatsoever. It is an obvious conflict of interest. You're not supposed to be investigating cases of people that you know and that you're involved with. He actually worked security at a bingo hall where her mother was and knew her personally. And again, it was speculated that the two dated, but they deny that. But yeah, that would be just cause in order to remove them from the investigation. And now the next thing that we get is this talk about a basement.
So then a bunch of erratic stories turned into one pretty substantial story that pretty much stayed all the way through, is that she would drive allegedly these kids to a house and they would take them down the basement, and pretty much every child said that it was a basement that they went to. It turns out, for example, Joseph Smith didn't even have a basement. It was a slab home. I mean, that's one fact out of a million facts that are true, that are so disturbing about the case.
So oftentimes the innocence fraud movement will hang their hat on some of these petty details right here and use that as proof positive that there is no case against the person that they're defending. And right here you hear that Joshua Allen did not actually have a basement in his home. But the thing is, a bunch of these kids gave different accounts of where they were being held at the time that these heinous crimes were committed against them, and it is entirely entirely possible, and by the way, totally in line with the theory of the prosecution at the time, that different kids were taken to different locations for these crimes to be committed. And what, of course, JD Tomlinson doesn't tell you, what he doesn't want to express to anyone, is that a few children, 2 by the way, he says it's a majority, but make no mistake about it, it appears to be 2 of them out of the 14 described a basement. The other children described objects that were present in the home of Joseph Allen that, by the way, investigators later confirmed. First and foremost, they were able to describe Batman sheets in one of the bedrooms where these crimes occurred. And guess what? Joseph Allen had those Batman sheets on his bed at the time he was arrested.
Though his home did not have the basement the children had mentioned, a search turned up toys and other items like these that the cops thought suspicious for a 40-year-old man who lived alone.
They were also able to describe specific toys that they were given to play with while they were there, and guess what? At trial, those toys were identified and confirmed by those children. They also described a scary Halloween mask, and something specific like that was also discovered at this guy's property. Now, Tomlinson says the kids were coached and they got all their stories in line, but what we see through the testimony is that it is not the case. All their stories were not in line. There were missing details and different contexts because it is very likely that these children were taken to different locations. But the key details that tie the home of Joshua Allen to these kids were left out of this Joe Rogan podcast because remember, this district attorney, this disgraced scumbag brought on here by Joshua Dubin, of course, didn't want to bring that up. He said he only found exculpatory evidence.
And so when I started to look at it, the funny part is during the first 3 or 4 months of me evaluating it, I had a couple investigators that were with me. And we were reading only exculpatory information. Nancy didn't do it. We don't think a crime occurred. And I was wondering, when am I going to start finding the inculpatory information? When am I going to start seeing the guilt? And it just really never happened.
And nothing that actually proved any guilt at all whatsoever. Now, based on just what I've explained to you thus far, you guys should be thinking to yourselves, okay, they're clearly and obviously obscuring the actual evidence in this particular case, but you know what? Some of you out there in the audience might be a bit skeptical. Some of you out there in the audience might think, you know, still, even though their story is not as completely full of holes as it was portrayed on the Joe Rogan Experience, it's not like there's anything in the past of either of these individuals that would indicate they would operate in this way. Like, you know, a pre-existing criminal history that is closely related to the crimes in which they were accused and convicted of in the 90s. And to be clear, that is obviously not the case. I mean, Joseph Allen was a criminal. I mean, he was a convicted murderer for a crime he committed, I believe, in the 70s. But just because you're a convicted murderer from the 70s doesn't mean that you're just going to start molesting kids in the 1990s. But the thing is, after I was looking into his criminal history, I also discovered that he's also a convicted child molester.
His full name was Joseph Allen, and he'd done time for murder and child rape.
In fact, in the 1980s, he sexually assaulted an underage person, and that person testified against him at this trial based on the experience that they had with Joseph Allen. In fact, Joseph Allen thought it was so bad that this person testified against him and described the details of what he did to that victim that he, on appeal, tried to get a new trial, saying that that completely biased the jury against him, and it was totally unfair to bring in that evidence because the details that that witness ended up giving, again, in another case where he was convicted, were so closely related to what he was accused of in the 1990s that according to him, that signed, sealed, and delivered the conviction. Now, none of this is mentioned by this absolute scumbag who wants to be praised for being the first person to ever apologize to a criminal defendant. None of this is mentioned by Josh Dubin. This isn't looked up by Joe Rogan or anybody on his team as they're having this conversation. We're just supposed to praise him for apologizing to this person who was an innocent Baba Angel Aladdin, and there was nothing to indicate that he committed this crime. So let me just give you a recap of where we're at with this completely innocent pair of individuals in this particular crime. According to JD Tomlinson, these children, for no reason, started exhibiting behaviors related to sexual molestation. By the way, some of the parents describe this as them trying to recreate what was done to them with their siblings, taking off their clothes, changing up their whole personality and whatnot. All of that was just made up by the parents as a big money grab, and they used their children to forward this agenda. And coincidentally, they decided that they were going to go after Nancy Smith and a black man that none of the parents knew called Joseph Allen. And coincidentally, the kids were able to describe Joseph Allen as not only a black man, but a black man with a skin condition. And even though Nancy Smith didn't know this individual at all whatsoever, coincidentally, they were able to do a Mac Jedi mind trick on the bus aide and make her conjure up a story about this man trying to approach the bus and how she was going to fight him off with the tire iron, and how Nancy told her that this was actually one of the parents, even though she knew that wasn't true. And then later on, they walked down the street and Nancy said that she would pick him up later, and this was in and around the school. Again, just a coincidence. Also a coincidence is that a huge number of the children involved in this particular case, which is just made up by the parents for cash grab, because remember, these parents did it for the money because they're so greedy and they're such nasty people. But coincidentally, that person that Nancy didn't know, but they have a witness to say that she did know him, was also somebody with a history of child molestation. On top of that, coincidentally, these children, who again were coached up by the parents, were able to identify specific objects in the home of Joseph Allen, including his bed sheets being Batman patterned. Really weird for an older man to have those child bed sheets. Specific children's toys, again, really weird for Joseph Allen to have in his home, and a Halloween mask. All of that was just coincidence. All of that was just set up by these greedy parents, and honestly, there's no evidence at all whatsoever for it, because JD Tomlinson told Joe Rogan that he looked over the case file and he found nothing but exculpatory evidence, nothing inculpatory in this case, just a bunch of coincidences that he wrote off so he can give his dramatic apology to these two defendants. Now, I will also add another coincidence, something that might not shock you, is that Joseph Allen was also staying with a bunch of runaway children, and those runaway children also accused Joseph Allen of child molestation. Again, coincidence after coincidence after coincidence.
But then in October, 5 months after the first allegations, detectives finally got the lucky break they'd been looking for. A man named Joseph suddenly appeared on their radar.
The reason he came to the attention of the detectives to begin with was the fact that he had a group of young juvenile runaways that he was harboring at his home and had sex with.
And so when I started to look at it, the funny part is during the first 3 or 4 months of me evaluating it, I had a couple investigators that were with me. And we were reading only exculpatory information. Nancy didn't do it. We don't think a crime occurred. And I was wondering, when am I going to start finding the inculpatory information? When am I going to start seeing the guilt? And it just really never happened.
Again, all of this is just coincidence. All of this is not evidence of any crime at all whatsoever, and in fact is just evidence of the greed and the disgusting nature of the parents. I mean, did you guys know that when one of the mothers figured out what happened to her kid, got the story out of her child, she decided to approach other mothers and other parents in the community and told them to get their kids checked because this could have happened to them because they were also on that bus? What a terrible, corrupt woman looking for a cash grab. Who would tell the other parents in their community that they think that their own child was molested and that they should protect their kids because it could have happened to them as well, other than a terrible, nasty, horrible person? This is actually the story that they put forward related to this case. This is the version of events this scumbag former district attorney and Josh Dubin, the scum of all scum, decided to bring on the Joe Rogan Experience. And by the way, this was all in their effort to forward the release of another group of murders that Josh Dubin has labeled the Ohio 4, which, guess what? They're all guilty of the crime as well, and we don't even have time to get into that. Now look, normally I will go to bat for Joe Rogan when I think he's in the right, but the fact is, when you have somebody like Josh Dubin, who has brought somebody on your show, lied through his teeth about how wonderful an individual he is, minimized the 2 attempted murders that he committed to just 2 stitches, minimized the fact that he was a high-level blood gang member and pretended like he just stumbled into that life of crime, and then that person who was released on Josh Dubin's recommendation goes out and murders somebody a month later, maybe you take a pause. Maybe, just maybe, you recheck into every single case that this guy brings you forward, because I got news for you. Show Sheldon Johnson is not the only guilty person that this guy has advocated for. Almost every single person, and I haven't found an innocent one yet, but I'm leaving the option open that maybe he'll stumble on one eventually, that he's brought up has been 100% dead to rights guilty, and that is true of Nancy Smith, and that is true of Joseph Allen. So enough is enough. I think I gotta draw the line when you bring on this woke, ridiculous person, district attorney, who apologized to child predators and is pretending that the overwhelming evidence against those predators doesn't actually exist. But you know what? Those are just my thoughts related to this case. I want to know what you guys think down in the comments below. As usual, if you like this video, show them by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on the social media, support me via the support links in the description of this video. This has been me shaming everybody on this Joe Rogan episode because they deserve it. Till next time.